Hello, music lovers. Welcome to episode 80 of What Makes This Song Special. I guess I should start this week's episode with an apology. It's been quite a few weeks since my last weekly episode. And although I've posted a few cover videos over the last couple of weeks, I've had a few messages asking me if I'd quit the storytelling. So let me explain. Firstly, there was always going to be a month without an episode because I went to Italy for pretty much the whole of July this year on holiday. I knew that it would be impossible to record something while I was there, so I just needed a break, family time, a recharge of the batteries. As much as I love making these little episodes for myself, as much as my millions of subscribers out there, it is quite time consuming. Sort of working out what the story's going to be each week, and the song, and then planning the cover, and even just setting up the studio to record and things like that. It can take a little bit of time. And between teaching singers, singing at weddings, playing with my band, writing songs, spending time with my wife, my 3 kids, making time for family and friends, all that stuff, it can be quite a lot to fit in to my week. However, I do love doing it. And it's just something that I'm going to continue to do, whether or not there are millions of viewers or not. But that's not the biggest reason. The biggest reason that I haven't recorded an episode for a few weeks is really because when I returned from my holiday, I kind of went to my list of upcoming episodes, because I've got like a few, as I've explained the format of the episodes before. These are all little stories that relate to a certain song that's important to me for some reason, and then I tell you a little story about why the song is important or why it's special to me, and you can obviously tell me in the comments why it's a special song to you. For me, I've got this list in my computer that I've had for ages, and when I hear a song, I think, oh, it reminds me of such and such. Would that be an interesting story to tell? And I'll make a note of it. And there are a few stories that feature awkward things to bring up. So yeah, I've looked at the songs and the stories that I have got kind of lined up, and so many of them aren't creatable or won't make sense until we speak about something that I've been putting off. And there are some things that are just difficult to talk about. And I've worn my heart on my sleeve more than once on this channel. And that's actually sort of sparked quite a good few conversations about, mental health, my chronic Lyme disease journey. I've spoken about personal family things, and things that are, personal to me and those close to me. But there's been one thing that obviously I've avoided, and that's talking about losing folk, losing people. Something that sadly happens to all of us at some point in our life, and losing amazing people that enter our lives who are no longer around. And that's always felt like too difficult a thing for me to do, for me to discuss on camera, alone in a room, if that makes sense. But there are so many stories that I want to tell on the channel about amazing songs that aren't doable without me talking about amazing people, and that is the elephant in the room today. And I thought, there are a few episodes coming up where I want to talk about certain people, and one person in particular, and it's awkward to talk about this person without sort of explaining what happened or how we met. So today we're going to talk about Daryl Elliott. Came into my life in early 2006. I was working as the head chef in a restaurant in the south side of Glasgow. I've spoken about that period of my life a few times on the channel. It spawned a few episodes and a few stories and a few songs. And I needed a sous chef, which is sort of like the assistant head chef. So essentially somebody that would run the kitchen on my days off, or if I went on holiday, that type of thing. So an assistant to the head chef. And I had a bunch of CVs that I'd been handed, or I don't know if you would call that resumes in the States, or I know people watch from different parts of the world. So in Britain we call it a CV, a curriculum vitae, or vitae, which is like just a list of why you should employ somebody. You make a little spreadsheet or whatever, talking about where you've worked before, what experience you've got, all that stuff, sort of thing. I think in America they call it a resume or whatever. So My general manager at the time had handed me a few of these CVs and decided on a few that I thought would be suitable enough to interview. Honestly, I remember scanning through a few and picking some folk who were round about the same age as me and the rest of the team in the kitchen. That's probably a crime these days. I'd get branded as an ageist or something like that, but I really just wanted to make sure the person who was coming on board would get on well with us all, and we were quite a young team. It was like me, my brothers, a few pals, and we'd all kind of found ourselves running this kitchen together, and we wanted somebody who would, have things in common with us, and age is a big part of that. And Daryl was the last person I interviewed for the job. He was a couple of years younger than me, and he was probably the least qualified of all the chefs that I interviewed that week. In hindsight, nowhere near ready to run a kitchen on my days off. But then I probably get thrown into the deep end and wasn't really ready to run a kitchen when I get given that job either. It's just, you kind of learn as you go. But he made an impression on me right away. Daryl turned up. He turned up in a 3-piece suit, ornamented with cufflinks and finished off with a wee pocket clock. This was for like a chef job that paid little over minimum wage. And I remember, trying not to laugh as I walked over to shake his hand and introduce myself. And I remember feeling that I remember overdressing, maybe not quite with the pocket clock and things like that, but I remember like completely overdressing for the interview when I'd come in to take the job in the first place as well. And so I saw a little bit of myself and his sort of nervousness and eagerness to make an impression, which was nice. And we sat down and we chatted for a while, and I quickly just realised what an amazing person he was. He'd been through so much crap in his life. He'd been through so much, so many things. It's not for me to, talk about. It's his business. But he'd been through a lot, and he still had this just huge infectious smile on his face. And his story's not for me to tell on here, but let me say it was inspirational. Very inspirational, and I was just hooked on like his charm, his energy from the second we sat down. And as I was talking to him, I remember like glancing at his CV on the table, trying to pretend that I'd already read it, when in actual fact I hadn't really read all of the CVs properly. And then while looking at the hobbies section while we were chatting, I noticed that it said he played drums, and this new information changed everything. I asked him about this, and he told me that his dream was to be a drummer, and that he'd been playing drums since he was 5 years old. And this light bulb went off in my head in that moment. I hadn't had a regular drummer for my own musical projects, my band and my solo project that I was working on. For like well over a year, I'd been like using different drummers, but I couldn't find anybody to take the position sort of full time. Everybody was doing other things or away in other tours with other bands and all these things, and I was desperately needing somebody to fill that seat in the band for this recording project that we had coming up. So I remember saying to him, "Oh God, I need a drummer even more than I need a chef," and we both started laughing. And I think he knew that he had the job based just off the back of that before he even walked back out to his car after the interview. Afterwards, I remember reassuring my manager that Daryl had given this great interview and he was perfect, he had great experience, he would be the perfect guy for the job. And then I filled his CV at the bottom of this drawer in the kitchen office, hoping that nobody ever found it and questioned why I'd taken on a guy who had absolutely zero experience of running a kitchen. He had worked as a chef, but not in a kind of management role or anything like that before. So I just in my head thought, you know what, this is going to be great. Nice guy, plays drums. I'll teach him how to cook and run the kitchen, and we'll just make it happen. So yeah, I sort of remember thinking, oh God, have I made a huge mistake, not realising that Daryl would become my best mate, and a huge part of a huge chapter of my life. Over the next few years, me and Daryl would spend time laying down the foundations to finishing my first album, working on my second album together, starting our journey of teaching vocals and drums at the same time. And these parallel sort of lives that we were living, and creating a wedding band together with two other pals that I'm still in today, 16 and a bit years later. The laughs we have had in that kitchen will be remembered by everyone who worked there at that time. He just loved being part of the journey in the kitchen and the band. We would study the greats. We studied Sting and Steely Dan and Queen together and all the other classics. Especially artists or bands that had incredible drummers. We would get to songs with ridiculously complex drum parts, and I would say, "Do you think you could play that?" And he would be like, "With one hand, mate," and he was with this kind of cheeky smile on his face, and he would say it like he was joking, but in actual fact, I don't think I ever heard Daryl struggle to replicate any drum part. He was just incredible. You could give him a piece in 7/8 and he would just, you'd go straight into it. And I think I've mentioned on this channel before, I think when we did my creating a superband episode, I'm not a drummer. I can throw a few beats out on a kit, very, very basic stuff. I'm not a drummer, but it is one of my favourite instruments. It's one of the things I really pay great attention to when I'm producing tracks, when I'm listening to songs. I just love the drums to be quite far forward in the mix. I love to hear intricate, unusual, interesting drum parts. So even though I'm not a drummer, we were able to talk in depth about the technicalities of drums, because I'm so much of a drum geek. And he was just incredible behind the kit. You know, he could just do anything that I asked, any kind of weird thing that I'd written into a song, tempo changes, time signature changes, syncopation, half time, double time, intricate sort of detailed parts. He could do it all. But the most endearing thing about Daryl was his character. Despite all he'd gone through, he'd been born with like severe heart complications, and he'd spent many years of his childhood living in hospital wards, sick, having numerous operations, missing school, missing playing with friends. Just such a sad story, and yet he had this smile on his face at all times, this charisma and this incredible talent. You know, I said it before, he was a real inspiration, a really inspirational guy, and I sort of took him under my wing. We were like best pals, but obviously he was 2 years younger than me, and 2 years, younger, or 2 or 3 years younger than me. I can't remember now. 2 or 3 years now as adults seems like nothing, but when you're in your early 20s, there's like it feels like a bigger gap. So he felt like almost like I took him under my wing like a sort of like a little brother at one point, and yeah, anyway, I'm avoiding the tough part. I'm sure you've guessed from where the story is moving that, Daryl didn't make it, passed away during a heart operation in 2011. And I honestly can't talk too much about that in detail. What happened that day, everything that unfolded on that horrific day, it's just not something I want to go into on here. None of you want to watch me sort of crying on camera, so we won't go into too many details, but it was, just something that I've just never been able to deal with, like almost 13 years on. It was so sudden, so difficult to process, so unfair, and I don't think, me and anybody who knew him will ever be at peace with it, to lose somebody he was 25 years old. So it's just a horrendous, sad story. And we'll move to the reason that the song is special and how this all links together and why I had to sort of explain that. So a year or so after Daryl started working with me, he started getting these terrible headaches. And we tried to put his mind at ease by telling him it was probably just coming from, like his neck muscles and things like that. But the more it went on, the more I started, trying to convince him to go to the doctor about it. I was starting to worry about him, and his doctor had told him that he thought it was tension headaches and gave him some paracetamol and things like that. But one afternoon when I was working with him in the kitchen, he just dropped to his knees, started shouting out in pain, and we had to call an ambulance. His dad came down and went with him, and we waited for a phone call to see if he was okay. And when he eventually phoned me, from the hospital, he told me that they'd scanned him and found out that he had a sort of build-up of fluid in his brain, and he was going to need brain surgery the next morning to save him. As you can imagine, me and the other guys in the work and in the band, who'd all become really close to him by this point, were all, worried sick. It was just a horrible sort of 24, 48 hours of waiting around for news. And I was working the next morning when he phoned me. I was in early in the kitchen prepping for the day ahead, and he phoned me in the morning. And he said, I'm going into surgery at 12 o'clock, mate. And so we chatted for a little bit, and I tried to, what do you say to somebody before they go in for a big surgery like that? You're worried sick, but you're trying to make them feel like it's going to be okay. And so I tried to give him all the positive stuff, and we talked about songs we would record once he was out and once he was better and all these things. And so we chatted for a bit, and then I wished him luck, and I went back to work, and I just kept looking at the clock, waiting for sort of 12 o'clock, because I knew that's when he was going into the theatre. So I couldn't concentrate at all. Felt sick, desperate for the day to be over. And at 12 o'clock, or just before 12 o'clock, I remember there were no checks on in the kitchen, and it was just quite quiet. And I went into the larder cupboard, the big walk-in larder cupboard where we kept all the tins of things, tins of beans, bags of flour, all that stuff. And I went in there and I locked the door, and it was pitch black in the cupboard. I couldn't even see my hand in front of me. And I closed my eyes and I prayed. I just prayed that he'd make it through the surgery. I'm not a religious person. I don't really make a habit of praying. But it was just this moment of desperation, asking God, the universe, or whoever's out there to help. And when I was in there saying the prayer for him and just having this little conversation in my head for a few minutes in the dark, the only thing I could hear was the sound of the little sound system in the kitchen playing, and it was playing Paul Simon late in the evening, as you probably guessed because of today's episode. And when I went back through, I put the song back to the beginning, and I remember listening to it 2 or 3 times. It just, I don't know, it just seemed like I was just enjoying the song. It was kind of taking my mind off things, and Daryl and I both loved Paul Simon and Steely Dan and all those bands, and so it wasn't a song that was really, I don't even know if Daryl and I had listened to that song together before or even talked about that song together before, but it was, I don't know, it was on, and I listened to it 2 or 3 times and then kind of forgot all about it. The rest of the day was a complete blur. I remember getting a call from Daryl's dad, Gordon, and he told me that Daryl was in intensive care during the operation. They'd found blood clots in his brain, and he had a couple of brain hemorrhages. I'm not really sure of what all that stuff means, as I'm not a doctor, but essentially it wasn't good news. He'd had, I think, a stroke. Essentially that's what a brain hemorrhage is. I think it's like a stroke in the middle of the operation. And then it was all about kind of waiting to see if things would improve enough for anybody to be allowed in to see him. Again, this is all a bit of a blur. I don't know if it was that night or the following night before he was allowed anyone in to visit. I remember that he had to come out of intensive care into the high dependency unit. I remember the only people who had given permission to go in and see him were his dad and me, which I remember just feeling really, really flattered by and kind of blown away by. And touched, and here's the point, of the story. It was either a Friday or a Saturday night. Daryl's dad and I went up to the hospital to see him, and Daryl's dad had been in already. He'd warned me before we went into the room that it would be quite upsetting, and to see him like that, just had like a major brain operation. So obviously, yeah, it's not, I won't go into too much detail, but it wasn't, nice to see him in that state. But I just remember him being so happy to see me. And the minute he saw me, I went over to the side of the bed, and I swear to God, he said, Late in the Evening was playing. And I was like, what? What? I'm still trying to process everything. He said, when I was counting down for the anaesthetic to kick in, Late in the Evening by Paul Simon was playing in my head. And I just burst into tears, and I had goosebumps all over my body. I was like, how did how did we just connect telepathically in that moment, from me saying a prayer in the kitchen larder cupboard, listening to that song in the background, to him lying in the hospital bed exactly the same time, about to have surgery, being counted down, get into anaesthetic. And I sort of, even he couldn't believe it when I told him the story either. And the two of us spoke about that so many times afterwards, and told people, and people find, I suppose, these things hard to believe. It 100% happened, and it is just one of the most kind of bizarre musical stories that I've ever kind of encountered. And I still can't get my head around it all these years later. Daryl and I did have this like really strange ability to read what each other were about to say, or on stage. We played many gigs together, and if I had a feeling in me that I was going to do like a stop on a track, he just read it, and vice versa. We kind of just knew there was a strange telepathic thing that we had on stage, and maybe that also was a thing. I don't know if these, it's hard to get your head around. It was a coincidence. Was it some sort of connection made on a level that we can't quite understand or contextualize as human beings, because it's not something that's been scientifically sort of investigated yet, or I don't know. But the song, of course, will always take me back to that day, with a really happy and sad feeling. It's Daryl recovered from that operation, and he had to relearn to use the whole left-hand side of his body, something that he was told by the experts at the time might take several months, maybe even into years, before he was able to do intricate things with his left hand again, his left foot. And Daryl was out playing drums at gigs with me about 2 months after that operation. It was just incredible. And if you want to hear Daryl's drumming, you can go to any of the streaming sites, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, YouTube, etc., and type in Rico Franchi, Auditory Dreams, and Daryl's the drummer on that entire album. There's other albums of mine where he's on a few tracks and things, but he's on that whole album if you want to hear his incredible work. Some people ask me about the pictures behind me on the wall here, and I've got obviously some legendary quotes and legendary song lyrics and legendary album and single covers that are inspirational to me. There's somebody that's always over my shoulder when I tell the stories, and sadly 2 people now, and there's another story there. My pal Chris, who's also up there just now with Daryl behind me, and we'll talk about Chris another time. That's a whole other story. But yeah, Daryl's always over my shoulder on stage, so he's always over my shoulder when I'm sitting here at the piano doing my songs and working in my studio. So that's him behind the kit in the picture there that you've probably seen a million times if you've watched the episodes. But yeah, if you want to hear him, as I said, you can dive into Auditory Dreams album. And there's my wee story this week. I'm going to leave the vocal coach analysis of Paul Simon for another episode. I know I always analyse the vocalist of the song's voice, and I don't want to. This is going to be quite a long episode already, so I think we'll leave that today. There are other Paul Simon songs that have stories for me that I'll maybe talk about Paul Simon's awesome voice on those. I just wanted to tell that story today because, as I said, there are other stories that feature Daryl, and I wouldn't really know how to broach those stories without having done this first. So thanks as always for listening. If you want to hear my cover version of Late in the Evening, which I'm going to do, a much slower, very different version of Late in the Evening to what the original is, then please click on the link that will pop up at the end of the video, as always. Please leave some comments if this song is special to you. For me, it's one of many songs, too many songs, sadly, that take me back to time spent with Daryl, an amazing pal who's hopefully up there somewhere playing with the great musical heroes of the past. But yeah, until next time, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week for hopefully a a slightly happier story, and another song. Thanks.